But I welcome each of you here. Mike, I'm glad you're back, and we look forward to your engagement with us today.
Well, again, as we did last time, I'm going to kind of run through a set of ideas or practices with you, and then we'll segue into a period of conversation with you putting whatever you'd like to contribute on the table or asking questions or challenging something I may have said. That's fine as well. I would remind you that these sessions are being recorded during the presentation uh, phase of today, but our conversations are not. So know that. And you're free to contact me by email or telephone if you want to continue the conversation. There's no charge for that kind of thing. I'm not a coach. I'm not a consultant. I'm a fellow practitioner. And let's just treat it that way. Uh, I think all of us understand the reality we're experiencing right now. Christy, you were alluding to getting off of Facebook a few months ago. That's one way some of us have dealt with it so that we could go on loving people anyway. But the reality as we experience it is often characterized in terms of congregations that are blue, congregations that are red, congregations that are purple. Uh, Personally, I've always found it more useful to think in terms of full spectrum congregations. The reality is there are many shades of red. There are many shades of blue. And there are many shades of purple. Almost any given individual you and I deal with in our congregations is not wholly red, wholly blue. Uh, I know a fairly elderly man who is blue in almost every aspect of his thinking and philosophy, but who cannot abide people who will not stand for the national anthem. He's a Navy veteran. He just cannot get over that. And yet he is one of the leading advocates of sexual equality, racial equality in the Knoxville area. Shades. So I'm much more comfortable over the years thinking in terms of my congregations, at least, as being full spectrum. I'm going to encounter people who are in many, many places, and you can't always predict how they will feel on a given matter or how they will hear your language. Because the other situation that we all face is folk parse our words and our actions uh, through the lens through which they view the world. They hear what they have learned to hear from in a given phrase. They see what they have learned to see in a given action. These are political filters, they're tribal filters, and they're very real. So you and I are hung with the question of what are we to do? How are we to be pastor in that kind of context? And of course, it's ratcheted up right now, but it's always this way to some extent. We've got to get over the idea that we are facing an absolutely novel situation. No, it's a heightened situation, in my opinion. So here are some things that over time I learned to try and do. The first is this: practice empathy. And it does require practice. I don't think empathy is extraordinarily welcome to the group, Drew. I don't think empathy is inherent in many of us. I think it's something that we learn. Empathy is the ability to enter into the mind and hearts of others and to see, at least in part, the world through their eyes. It's a working definition of empathy. When we practice empathy, we become increasingly empowered to see the humanity in the other person, even when they drive us up the wall. Empathy, at least in my experience, is work. And it's a work of inquiry, investigation, and a bit of imagination. I have found that working hard at listening well helps build empathy. Frankly, I have found that reading widely in fiction helps build empathy. Fiction, perhaps more than any other form of literature, because you move into the hearts and the minds and the motivations of these fictional characters. And lo and behold, you begin to recognize some of these ideas, these realities in the actual lives of the people with whom you're dealing. I would also add that I found it worth the time to read widely in serious biography. Again, this builds empathy because serious biography investigates the motivations, the worldviews, the forces which shaped people in the past. And that's transferable to dealing with people in the present. Empathy requires that you and I work very hard to get inside the mindset of people who fear or loathe other races, other political groups, or even other Christians. And I had a lot of experience in that during the Baptist Wars, believe me. It's helped in this current situation. When we do all this work of empathy, it gives us a way to come at Scripture that is a little different than what we may have learned in more formal settings. When we work hard to get inside the mindset of people who are just on the wrong page, to be quite honest, we start to get insight into biblical characters we might not otherwise have. And we begin to be able to spin stories about those biblical characters. For example, it becomes possible for us to imagine ourselves into what it was like to be born into and reared in a Pharisaic home in the first century diaspora. It becomes possible for us to weave a story about the life of the child Saul, who became Paul, how he would have been trained to see the world, what he would have been trained to admire, what he would have been trained to fear, and how that affected the course of his unfolding life. When you can spin that kind of story, and you've got to use your imagination to do it, people start to relate to that story. And you can do things with Paul that you just couldn't do when you were doing Greek conjugation only, for example. Sometimes, for example, if you study biography and history enough, you can spin the story of what it was like to grow up as a Roman in the first century world and what you were taught to believe about yourself and your people as opposed to all those other folk out there. And one of the things you learn rapidly and can play with in story fashion is how very much afraid the Romans were of the rest of the world. They honestly believed the world was an intensely dangerous place, and this drove their push toward empire and toward expanding their boundaries and how they reacted to threats and how they saw other people as somehow less than human. Spin a story about a little boy or a little girl growing up there, and people start to relate to that story, and they begin to wonder, am I a little bit like that? Actually, first century Roman culture has many parallels to 21st century American culture in this regard. So empathy fed by stories, fiction, history, biography, expands our repertoire and at least gives us the raw material with which to spin stories that are actually backdrop stories, backstories to scripture stories. I have found over the years that people listen when you spin this type of story. Almost none of them ask you, is that literally true? They just listen to the story and it begins to seep in over time. So I think we have to desire empathy, work toward empathy, and then realize that empathy provides a real tool for unpacking scripture in a slightly different way. Another thing I have found useful, at least, is to try to redefine the issues into Christian speak, whatever the issue may be, whether it's racism, politics in general, equality of men and women, etc. But you can redefine the issues into Christian speak, and you and I do this best with biblical text and biblical stories. A familiar one, I'm sure, to all of us is how you redefine the Sodom and Gomorrah story from being a story about God's wrath over a human sexuality matter into a story of hospitality or the lack of hospitality, xenophobia in play, which is exactly what was in play. The dangers of being the alien in the midst who tries to buy into the power system in existence. That's Lot's story, and it backfires on him rather quickly. When you come at a biblical story from those type angles, people listen. And they will always say the same thing to you, or nearly always. I never heard it put that way before. Well, they've probably heard it 20 times, but it may have to be spoken 50 times to begin to sink in. What they listen to is the story you spin. Give you some other examples. The Good Samaritan story can actually be spun in terms of one question. What can I do to help is the only right question to ask. And you can play with all the other questions that were being asked by people in the story as they encountered the victim on the road, or what have you. The loving father story, Terry and I were talking about that earlier. I have a set of sermons, but they all deal with the same thing when it comes to the story of dad and the two sons, the farm, etc. The Good Samaritan, not the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son stories, it's often told. I love to cast that story in terms of one question. Why do we resist seeing God as Jesus sees God? Jesus portrays God in that story as a loving parent who's going to love all of God's children, regardless of how they try him, how they test him. He's going to love all of his children, even when some of his children think he shouldn't. He's going to love all of his children, even when some of the children think they no longer deserve to be loved. He's not going to allow his children to tell him to stop treating any of them as children. You see how you can play with that? It's a very familiar story that you kind of take in a different direction, and people actually listen and respond, and they begin to think of people they know or of themselves as you spin the story that way. 1 Corinthians 13 is a good text for our time. And the question in my mind to ask as we deal with the realities of our time is something like this. What had to change for Paul to become able to pen such words? Because early in his life, he could not have written that. He could not have meant that. He couldn't even have conceived it. So what were the changes that had to happen, however suddenly or over time in the life of Paul, to bring him to this recasting, this reframing of what he thought to be most important? You catch the drift, don't you? We did a sermon series at Central a couple of years ago entitled Through the Eyes of Others. Josh Beeler and I worked on that idea together, and we went and found several scripture stories and told that story or retold it through the eyes of the non-central participant. Instead of talking about Jesus, we talked about someone else in the story and how they saw things that were happening in the story. Woman at the well, etc., comes to mind. Does that give you some ideas? Does all that make any sense to those of you who are here? Okay. Another thing I found useful, we alluded to it last time because it's just part of my approach to being a pastor, but I think it's important in times like these. Become the non-anxious presence in the congregation. Be the calm in the midst of the storm. And I say that because we're living with very anxious people right now. Facebook and social media do drive a good bit of the anxiety. Real economic loss, real fear, real hatreds drive anxiety. And we're living right now with people who tend to demand quick verbal response and quick actions. And some of them intend to turn us into people who give such responses and take such actions, knee-jerk responses, knee-jerk actions. We can be a different kind of person than what they expect us to be. We become that calm in the midst of the storm. Well, I'll give you an example. Try listening without speaking many times. You'll get cornered by somebody. They'll come at you either online or in person or by phone. And what they're looking for you to do is to start responding to every clause, every phrase they use. Just listen. It's confounding to them. It's not what they're used to. They have been reared nowadays on social media, on talk programs, on panel programs where people don't listen to each other. Instead, they just shoot back and forth, often interrupting one another. Be the person who listens so long that they start to repeat themselves and they start to run down and they're not quite sure what to do with your silence. It really changes the dynamic of an encounter. And when you do this, you model not being pulled into knee-jerk response. You model not becoming overly agitated by what you're just hearing or reading. You model actually listening to another person. And some learn from that model. And at the very least, you remain yourself in the midst of it all. Try hard to become the person in the congregation who speaks calmly and clearly in various settings. Model civility in a time of incivility. Model the habit of research. Many of our people are operating out of non-factual databases. You can model a person who does his or her research, and model engagement with a diversity of people. Do this in front of your people. You do it by telling stories again. Through sermons and in teaching settings and other settings, I often tell stories of my friends, the rabbis, particularly Micah and Rami, my two best friends among rabbis, one in Memphis, one in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I tell stories about Father Nick, who died just recently, but he was the reigning Greek Orthodox priest in Memphis, Tennessee, and the stories are just marvelous. I tell stories about the Buddhist male nurse we took with us on mission trips to Central America at Second Baptist Church, and how we interacted with one another and with people. I tell stories about the imam in Memphis, who consistently told those of us who are Christian ministers, please complete your prayers in the name of Jesus Christ, because after all, you are Christian. It was just remarkable. I tell stories about Mr. Cody's family. Mr. Cody was an Afro-American elderly gentleman where I grew up. He had something on the order of 42 grandchildren, and most of them ate at my grandmother's table on a regular basis. We grew up together in many ways. Just the stories of our interaction as we moved through elementary school, high school, and into our first jobs speaks to people. I tell stories of other friends, of other races and religious backgrounds. Now, I tell those stories partially because they're fun, partially because people listen to stories, but over time they send a message to your congregation. Our pastor has friends who are diverse. Our pastor has friends who probably disagree with him theologically on any number of issues, and who come from very different backgrounds than that in which he and most of us probably grew up. We think our pastor is Christian. Could it be okay for a Christian to actually be comfortable with diversity and with friends whom he's not actually trying to convert to his viewpoint, but whose company he enjoys? You simply model a non-anxious approach to the actual diversity we have in our culture and our world. And it's funny, they'll start to ask you if you've heard from your friend lately. This opens doors for pastoral conversation, I can assure you. Now, it does involve a bit of biography. You've got to be willing to share this part of your life, and you don't do it and then say, and the point of me doing it is this. You just do it, and you trust that people will begin to pick up on it. Another thing, it's a discipline for me, and it took me a while to get here, but it's very crucial. It's just absolutely crucial that we practice love for each church member. Love is a practice. It's not a feeling for us. I mean willed love. I mean what we talk about when we speak of agape love. And that kind of love insists on remaining always connected. And it's always potentially sacrificial. And that's the part I think we shy back from sometimes. Why can't that kind of love be returned? It's not always returned. But it is part and parcel of the Christian calling, and certainly part and parcel of our calling. That kind of love always starts and sticks with the assumption that each person is fully human, and nothing can change that. Each person really is a child of God, whether he or she actually knows it at the moment or even acts like it. Now, there's a practical implication for such love in the life of a pastor. Your love, this kind of love for them, becomes the foundation of whatever trust they may place in you. It's amazing how transformative it can be in the life of another person when he or she becomes convinced they can't make you stop loving them in this way. I think one of the real drivers of much of the incivility with which you and I deal is a fear of rejection, reality. And they're going to test to see if they can make you give up on them. Agape doesn't give up. It just doesn't do that. It becomes the foundation of their trust in you. It's that kind of trust that enables them increasingly to actually hear you when you speak, or consider the challenges you may offer them, or run the risk of changing their minds or their actions at your request. So you tell them you love them, and then you actually do it. And it's just hard work sometimes. I know what it feels like to want to just turn a corner and walk away when you see someone coming. I do. But this discipline is necessary. And the strange thing is, it's catching. The more you do this, the more apt a few of your people are to catch it from you, so to speak. It's almost like an infection that spreads in a congregation from time to time. So I recommend it to you. Another thing that I found useful was to be always on the move among the people, always on the move among them, to be visible and accessible. I grew up in an era of theological training when we were strongly urged to sequester ourselves on Sunday until it was time to preach. You had to get ready to preach. Well, if you're not ready by the time Sunday begins, you're not apt to be ready. It's just the truth. So what I did for decades, once I finally got comfortable doing it, I haunted the halls of the church for an hour to an hour and a half before the Bible study hour. I haunted the halls of the church on Wednesdays for a couple of hours. I walked in to greet people in meetings. I walked the halls of the church and got some exercise, by the way. My rule of thumb the last decade of my ministry was work 45 minutes, be out in the halls 15 minutes. Just that simple. Got my walking in, and I kept running into people by doing so. I think in the business world, it's management by moving out, walking among. It also works in the church world. And it's amazing what happens. People get used to you being accessible in this way, and then they begin to stop you every now and try some conversation. In some cases, those conversations grow over time, and they become real conversations, not just how you doing and that kind of thing. Church members at Murfreesboro and Second Memphis and Central Fountain City began to learn that they could actually stop me, and that was okay. That they could have a genuine conversation, and that was okay. And what I liked about it was this was a fair situation in which to have a conversation, for they could walk away if they chose to do so. They could talk back in a way they couldn't do during a sermon, or at least I hoped they wouldn't do during a sermon. Over time, they could get very honest with you. Of course, many of these conversations are in semi-public settings, so both of you tend to remain a little more civil, I think, during those times. And over the course of those years, in those kinds of conversations, I found that I could not only plant some seeds, I could also begin to see some people begin to change their minds occasionally. Usually not in some huge way initially, but a little bit at a time, as they became aware that all of this was real. You could actually talk with one another and maybe hear one another. And some of them actually began to trust me enough to enter into more involved conversations, deeper topics. Now that seems slow, because we live in a culture that if you can't fix it today, something must be really wrong. It is often slow, but real ministry, in my experience, involves short, mid-range, and long-term goals. All three. And genuine shepherding always does, in my opinion. So I recommend becoming a haunter of the hallways, if you will, if you want to actually practice pastoral ministry in an age such as this one. Last week, we started down a road, and I promised I'd come back to it this week, so I want to do that now. I found it useful to pick a small group and invest myself in changing its culture as an investment in changing the culture of the larger church. Always, I found it useful. And probably the best example is some of the work my colleagues and I did at Central Fountain City over the last few years. I chose the deacon body to be that small group. The deacon body at Central consisted initially of 42, quote, active deacons. We finally got that reduced to 24, which was much more realistic in relation to the size of our congregation. And at that point, I thought, as I think I alluded to last week, that they had reached a point of holy discontent with the way deacon ministry was done or not done. They didn't have a clue why they were even deacons or why they bothered to get together once a month. It was the pits to go to those meetings. So we did a one-day Saturday retreat. And we began with the core assumption that the ministry assigned to our deacon body was to maintain and strengthen the fellowship of the church, model following Christ in various ways, and to work in collaboration with the ministerial staff to make this happen. That was kind of the mission statement that I put before them, and they adopted it fairly readily. Then we spent the rest of the day working through a model of how deacons might grow into the kind of persons and body that could fulfill that mission. Now, I built off some work I did with other people that resulted in a book. I don't really recommend the book to you, but I like the core concepts behind what developed. We worked through what deacons need to be, what deacons need to know, and what deacons need to do in order to have the kind of ministry we envisioned in a church body. And during that one-day retreat, I took them through numerous examples of all three categories, how that would look in practice as a deacon body. They took about a month to think about it, and then they agreed that we would structure our deacon meetings around those three core actions. What do deacons need to be? What do they need to know? And what do they need to do? So for 3 going on 4 years, we did this about 10 times a year because we took a couple of months off from deacon meetings every now and then. We would spend 5 minutes with intro, prayer, and a brief meditation. We would spend about 15 minutes, maybe 20 some days, working on something that deacons needed to know. We would then spend 5 to 10 minutes hearing one of our fellow deacons share his or her spiritual journey story, and we gave them helps on how to develop those stories. Every meeting included one of those stories because deacons, among other things, need to know one another well. We would then spend the remainder of the time on something that deacons need to do, and they would leave that meeting with things they were going to do that day or that month, individually or as a body. Now, a funny thing happened when we did this. I'm sure all of you have every deacon come to every meeting and they're so glad to be there, right? We ran around 40 to 50% most of the time. From the day we began to take this approach, deacon attendance averaged 90% of enrollment consistently for almost 4 years. I promised them that if they would enter into this process at the end of their 3-year active term, they would leave it a different person than when they entered it. And I think we kept that promise. Now, they were a purple group. They were a full spectrum group, and they still are, insofar as I know. But over that 3 or 4 years, they grew into a genuine fellowship through all these shared learning and doing activities. And we studied the faith journey story of other people. we practiced crafting our individual faith stories. And later on, I began to move them out into congregational worship and allow them to share those stories with the congregation. And these were diverse stories. They were not cookie cutter stories. We tackled key scriptures and unpacked them in detail along with possible applications in that setting. We did a lot of work with church and secular history, trying to identify forces and events that continued to affect our theology, our sense of how the world works, our perspective. This was seminary or graduate school level work in small segments, but with a pastoral touch and with application and something you could do with it almost immediately or in the next month. We looked at the whole question of how do you lead change in congregational life? And I will tell you my prejudice, I'm always a fan of appreciative inquiry approaches when you're leading change, but we also had to unpack other less productive ways. And I will tell you that Central furnished enough history of less productive ways to where it could become quite real to our deacons. And every month we left with a set of actions to be taken. Very clear, nothing very long, just something real to do with what we had learned. By the end of 3 or 4 years, the deacon body had become a force in that congregation. Not a formal force, they had no administrative responsibilities in the congregation, but they became a force that increasingly was able in a business meeting setting or a congregational meeting setting or in their Bible study groups or other social settings to actually model civil conversation, rational thinking, paying attention to the Jesus story and why. They were not becoming theologians, but they were becoming much better rounded Christian leaders. And they knew it in the end. I have to tell you, they walked with a certain pride. I don't mean arrogance, just a certain pride that I had not seen in deacon bodies very often along the way. And the deacon meeting and the deacon body began to become a place in which we could have at least the beginnings of hard conversations, sometimes in a relatively safe environment because we had built a relatively safe environment. And what went on in that body filtered out into the congregation. Now, I don't know if they'll keep doing it. I'm not there now. I'm retired, thankfully. But I do recommend the general idea of pick some smaller group within the church because you can't work with every group in the church in this intensive way. So pick a group you think can become yeast in the congregation and put your life into it. It really makes a difference in any era, but especially in the kind of era in which we're living right now. And we'll come back to that if you want to talk about it. A couple of other things. Beware of the what I call a false distinction between pastoral and prophetic preaching. I think what you and I do most often is congregational preaching. And that inevitably blends the prophetic with the pastoral because you know your people and you hurt for them and you hurt with them and you also aspire for them and aspire with them. The best congregational preaching for an era like ours, in my opinion, takes the biblical text, the congregation, and the social context seriously. And it often needs a bit of personal biography as well to bring life to it. Congregational preaching most often is more like a steady stream washing away an occasional bit of rock than it is a flood. Occasionally something larger gives way. But congregational preaching, I think, is the way to go in this era in combination with the other things I've said. A couple of other things, and then we'll see what we can do together. I'm going to go J.R.R. Tolkien on you for a moment. Do not take up the one ring. Do not take up that ring of power. Or if you want to be biblical, pay attention to the temptation narratives, because those two things are the same. There's a terrible temptation to fight fire with fire. a terrible temptation to take up the tools of the devil to do God's work. And it's strong right now. That's not something a pastor can or should do. It's not our calling. We have to consciously walk away from, how can I put it, becoming that which we're fighting. All I can say on the matter is that if you take up that one ring, inevitably you will wind up becoming a person you are not. You will wind up becoming a person who will do small and great evils in the service of whatever it is you believe in. So that's the negative here. You and I live with a real temptation, and it's grounded right in those temptation narratives in Scripture. By the way, your people live with the same temptation, and you can spin the temptation narratives to speak to it. Two more things. Encourage by your presence, prayer, and other support forms of activism undertaken by your people, but drop the idea that they need to get everything right, because they won't. Human motives are always mixed. Human understanding is always limited. They're not always going to get theology and sociology and everything else right. But if they're doing something right, it might just change their lives. Actions tend to shape us over time. I'll give you a couple of examples. We spent nearly 2 years preparing to take 80 people to Puerto Rico out of Central Baptist Church. And they were just going to do construction work and vacation Bible school stuff. Sounds like one of those mission trips that we all have doubts about at some levels. But we also spent a solid year preparing them for the trip. Now, I want to give credit to Josh Beeler, the student minister at Central. He came up with the idea and with a little prodding shaped it. If you were going to go on this trip, you had to agree to undergo intensive training ahead of time. Part of that training, and maybe the most transformative part prior to the trip, was you got to learn the history of Puerto Rico in detail. You got to learn the history of how the United States government has treated Puerto Rico, and there are various aspects to that story. We made sure that some of our children actually began to grapple with Spanish. It was amazing to our people they didn't need a passport to go to Puerto Rico. You'd be surprised how much that changes people when they finally learn why. We trained them in, well, everything you can think of, but mainly they had to tackle a piece of American history about which they had not been taught before. So when they arrived in Puerto Rico, they didn't come in as the great rescuers. They came in as fellow American citizens who happened to be Christian. And while in Puerto Rico, of course, they encountered people with enormous drive, enormous energy, enormous faith. And they came back, I won't say transformed, but a segment of them came back really changed. And even now, across the age spectrum, because we took everybody from students to senior adults on this trip, 80 people, that was about 1/5 of our morning worship attendance. Even now, they are engaged here in Knoxville in similar work because they've learned they don't know everything about other people. And they are willing now to enter into study and conversation so that they learn about all the immigrant society in Knoxville and that they're real people. You see what I'm saying? Now, if I had insisted that they get all the theology right and missiology right, it would have bogged down. Let's just go do something right and learn something along the way, and then see how it spills over later. I could tell you the similar story with First Murfreesboro, a ministry to a slew of Katrina refugees. It went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you had folk coming to you soon saying, when are these people going to be leaving? Because if they don't leave, we're going to start losing the good people. And you know what they meant. It was all racial driven because Katrina refugees in Murfreesboro were primarily Black and primarily poor. A strange thing happened. We stuck with it, and lots of good people emerged to provide medical care, food, counseling, transportation, assistance with housing, assistance with job placement. And some of our people learned that you can run the risk of doing a good thing and that good people will emerge as a result. And they also learned to live with loss because some people did leave. Those are important lessons when it comes to change in a church. It works with individuals. I've got a fellow I'll call David here in Knoxville, nuclear engineer. And I mean engineer to the bone. You know, if he didn't have a flow chart, David couldn't follow it. But over time, through those hallway conversations, David became aware of a ministry to the AIDS victims of Knoxville. And as he moved toward retirement, he went into that ministry and he began giving transportation, taking food, listening. David moved from being a fairly traditional Baptist in the South to being a social activist over the course of 36 months. But again, he went into it thinking, well, I'm just going to help some of these poor people who've messed up their lives. And he learned that's not how it had worked. Now, here's the thing. David is part of a 3-generation family in Central Baptist Church. Each of those generations are key leaders in Central Baptist Church. This is filtering through even now. So encouraged by your presence, your prayers, and any support you can give people who try to do good things. Don't expect them to be perfect, but don't be surprised when some fairly remarkable results ensue. The last thing I'll say, I think today, is you really have to trust the Jesus story. You've just got to learn to trust it. The best thing I know in season and out is to tell the stories of Jesus, come at them from different angles maybe than you learned earlier on, but tell the stories of Jesus, preach on them, teach on them, bring them up in conversation. Don't be afraid to sound like somebody who knows the Bible occasionally. Do all you can to help your congregation experience what it's like to subject all other stories to the Jesus story, to measure all other stories against the Jesus story. Help them experience through word and deed what it feels like to subject their decision-making, assumptions, and actions to the Jesus story. Because in many ways, that's our primary task. It is our calling as pastors. And it's hard because you and I are faced with and sometimes beaten down by the story of the world around us. And that story is too often characterized by prejudice, power games, violence, binary thinking, lying, and winning at all costs. The only story we really have to counter that story is the Jesus story. And all I can say from my own experience is I understand how hard it is to hold on to that as our task. But I also learned and relearned, I mean, over and over again, that my most consistent role in the midst of it all was to be the teller of the great counter story. Again and again and again. And the upside of that is I have seen instances in which that story was taken in, assimilated, and in which it unleashed something really good in people. Well, that's about all I got, guys. But let's talk.